Is a little late, so sorry for the interruption when that comes in. It just can't be avoided, so I guess it will be here about 12:30. Yeah. Okay. We want to begin today by acknowledging that St. Mary's University is located on the ancestral and unceded land of the Mi'kmaq Nation. We acknowledge the treaties of peace and friendship which Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725, which did not deal with the surrender of lands, but which were meant to and to continue to bind us all in commitment to an ongoing relationship. As members of a settler state that actively benefit from our colonial legacy, we are called to recognize the insufficiency of these land acknowledgements and couple them with sincere efforts to decolonize our thinking and work actively to support Indigenous communities on campus and beyond. This could take several forms, including advocating for the inclusion of more Indigenous knowledge keepers among our faculty and student population, exploring opportunities for working against the erasure of Indigenous culture through educational art experiences here at St. Mary's, and also through partnerships with Indigenous communities and the municipality, and supporting our communities materially by donating to the Mi'kmaq Friendship Center. As we join Dr. Doris Bergen in thinking through the intersection of religion and genocide during the Second World War and the Holocaust, we are called also to reflect on this intersection in our own colonial history and how this legacy continues to affect our Indigenous communities today. Doris has asked me to keep this introduction short, and I will do my best because our personal and professional connection does incline me to gush about her for quite a while. Doris Bergen is the Chancellor Rose and Ray Wolfe Professor of Holocaust Studies in the Department of History and Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. This academic year, she is the J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Senior Scholar in Residence at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She is the editor, author, and co-editor of 6 books, including Between God and Hitler, Military Chaplains in Nazi Germany, published by Cambridge University Press just last year, which we will hear more about today, and War and Genocide, A Concise History of the Holocaust, the 4th edition of which is in progress, and which for anyone working, teaching, or even interested in the field is the seminal book. She is a fellow of the Royal Canadian Society of Canada and was part of the team that designed the National Holocaust Monument in Ottawa. She is a member of the Committee on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. On a more personal note, Doris was part of my doctoral supervisory committee at the University of Toronto. She is a mentor and a friend, and having her here is a bit of a full circle moment for me, and I'm absolutely delighted that she's here to share some of her incredible work with us today. So please join me in welcoming.
Thank you so much for the beautiful introduction, Lindsay, and it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. I also want to thank all the people who helped Lindsay organize this event. I know Mary Hale, Ashley were very involved. I know Alec, the department chair, so thank you all for the invitation and the hospitality. I also want to thank the artist Imani Brown, who designed my PowerPoints, and I want to thank the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, where I'm in residence this year, and it's something we're required to say, and I think it's important that the opinions and interpretations I'm offering are my own and do not represent the Holocaust Memorial Museum. So my topic, Between God and Hitler, is the title of my book, but my topic, the military chaplains in Nazi Germany, it might seem like a kind of niche subject. There were about 1,000 men, about equal numbers, Protestant pastors and Catholic priests, who served the Wehrmacht as chaplains throughout World War II. And I have to tell you, when I started working on this topic 30 years ago, not many people were interested. One of the most dramatic responses I got was an early talk I gave in Washington State, like probably, I don't know, in the 1990s. And a couple of Vietnam vets were waiting for me outside the venue. And they said, "Are you the one talking about military chaplains?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "We hated those guys." They didn't mean the World War II chaplains. They meant their own chaplains. They said all they did was patch us up and send us back out. That made a deep impression on me. But 30 years of working on this topic, sadly, public interest has sort of caught up with the subject of German military chaplains. After 9/11, after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and more recently in Ukraine and now Israel, Gaza, the subject of military chaplains is in the news a lot. I found that this topic is a really good way in to a number of big questions about religion and violence, specifically about the role of religion, in my case Christianity, in war, about the importance of institutions, and about how systems of power hide themselves. So my talk has 3 parts. They each have a little title. And in all 3 parts, I want to foreground some of the sources that I used, the process, and my own work, having worked on that for so long. And I hope you'll find that interesting. And I also want to thank the people in the audience who've agreed to read texts for me, and you'll see them when the time comes. Okay, so who remembers the Wehrmacht Chaplains, Part 1? My project began really as a gap. I was working on a different subject for my dissertation, and I came across a letter in a church archive written in 1935 by a Lutheran pastor in Looseland, Saskatchewan, which happens to be where my father grew up. I don't know if anybody else around here knows where Looseland, Saskatchewan is. It's a very small place. That German Lutheran pastor was writing to the Protestant Reich bishop asking if he could get a job as a military chaplain. Germany had just rearmed. I was curious because I was writing my dissertation on a topic about the churches. I had never heard mention that the Wehrmacht had Christian chaplains. So I decided to look into it, and I started with maybe an obvious source, which was the, which was the reports that chaplains submitted up the military chain of command. Those reports are pretty readily available at the Federal Archive in Germany. Many of them are also at the National Archive in the US with the captured German records. And I read hundreds of them. The problem was most of them were very dry. They were like this report that basically listed how many religious services did the chaplain conduct, how many communion or mass did they serve, how many burials. It didn't really come alive. So I was all the more delighted when I came across certain individuals, like this man, the Catholic chaplain Hermann Reible, who wrote very detailed, extensive reports that provided a lot of detail about the daily life and even about some of the emotional, challenges of the work of the chaplain. So I want to get reader number 1 to read us an excerpt from the report of Chaplain Reible, written, you can see there, in the occupied Soviet Union in the first part of 1942. And I want to point out to you that these months, early 1942, were a peak year of German killing of Jews and also Soviet prisoners of war in precisely this territory. So reader number 1, raise your hand. Excellent. Whenever you're ready. You got the hardest job.
19 March. I traveled to Fedusova for the execution of Private GS, condemned to death for desertion. When informed that he had been given the death sentence, S fell apart. I spent the entire night in a cell with him, and he soon calmed down. He showed remorse for his disgraceful deed, and after receiving the Holy Sacrament, wrote 2 letters of farewell. 20 March, 6:45 a.m. 2 sergeants came for S and took him to the execution site. I prayed with him along the way, about 600 yards. 20 March, 7 a.m. Spiritual support for S was composed and strong in front of the firing squad. burial with prayers for the executed man. 1 June. The last part of this activity report is supposed to summarize the situation at the main dressing stations where I've been providing spiritual care. It's a terrible scene of blood, wounds, and death. It's an enormous strain on one's nerves to see nothing day and night but blood and shredded human bodies, to hear nothing but moans of pain from wounded soldiers and the death rattles of dying comrades. No one except the priest assigned to the clearing station has the opportunity to spend those last hours, the most difficult time, with these dying comrades. No one else can transmit to loved ones at home so many important final words and wishes. May the souls of the dead heroes, who I have been privileged to help lead to the heart of God their Father, find eternal rest from their suffering. But may the blood of their hearts, spilled for the homeland, be the everlasting bond for the building of a free and great Germany.
Thank you for that really fantastic reading. I was intrigued by Reible's report of the daily grind of the chaplain's work, and even more intrigued by the anguish that he expressed in this passage. I wondered, could it be a kind of code? You know, later in the report, it became clear that he was very sick at the time. I think he actually had a heart attack. And I wondered if his own illness had sort of cracked open his defenses. And in that talk about the anguish and the blood and the shredded bodies, he was perhaps expressing some kind of, remorse for the victims of the Germans. However, upon working more with the subject, learning more about Chaplain Reible and his colleagues, I concluded that it was probably wishful thinking on my part, that the pattern of their reporting, in fact, suggested that where he returned in the end of this comment to that safe ground of nationalism was where his heart was and where he spent the time. Still, reports like this were extremely important evidence for me because they indicated that chaplains were present in the midst of violence, in the heart of the German war of annihilation. I kept looking for more such reports. I did find in a few post-war memoirs by chaplains descriptions of mass murders of Jews and other victims, but they were always written like third hand, right? Not as if the person himself had seen it, but rather someone had told him. In other words, reported as from a great distance. And they always emphasized the tragic powerlessness of the chaplains. So I was all the more thrilled when I came across a report by another Catholic chaplain, Father Ernst Tevis. In this case, not a wartime report, but a post-war memoir in which he described the killing of a group of Jewish children in the city of Bielec Cerkva in German-occupied Ukraine in August of 1941. Now, Chaplain Tevis was one of two chaplains, together with his Protestant counterpart, who testified in the 1960s at the trial of the German murder squad who had killed most of the Jews in Bielec Cerkva. So this account, which I'm going to get you to hear from reader number 2, is Tevis's account of the post-war testimony based on notes that he took in 1941. So reader number 2, where are you? Excellent.
I am sure I would still recognize that building today. We found about 90 little Jewish children, among them some infants, in a hopeless situation, packed together, whimpering, crying, hungry and thirsty in the midday heat. Most of their parents had been shot, and some of their mothers were confined in an adjacent room. Through a window, they could see their children's agony, but they could do nothing to help them. Both of us agreed absolutely that against all orders, we would get involved and put ourselves on the line. The children and their mothers, like so many others before them, were to be shot by an SS Sonderkommando.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So this report, too, really struck me. I thought, would you categorize the response of those chaplains as resistance? Was it somehow an expression of an intact Christian conscience? I didn't know what to do with that source. I wasn't the first to discover it. In fact, I learned that in the 1960s, when the two chaplains testified, their testimony was widely publicized in the international press, and they were hailed as heroes, the presence of a kind of Christian conscience in the midst of a, hellish war. For me, too, I kept it at this evidence was basically proof that chaplains were present, that they knew about the crimes of the Wehrmacht, and that they had moral standing with their men. So Tevis and the other chaplain, you can't see it in the part that you read, but they were actually approached by German soldiers. That's how they knew to go to that building and see the children. So if I'd have finished my book in the 1990s, when I was supposed to, I would probably have just ended there. Chaplains knew, they were aware, they had moral standing. But that's not what happened. In 2007, I left my job at the University of Notre Dame and moved to the University of Toronto, a very different setting. Suddenly, instead of being in a Catholic university, I was in a very large university with an active center for Jewish studies, with which I was deeply involved, with graduate students and undergrads who spoke multiple languages, many of whom I hired as research assistants, and really important, in a time when the field, history, that I work in was changing rapidly. Holocaust studies was increasingly emphasizing integrated histories, bringing the perspectives of victims and targets of violence to shape the narrative, and also within history, searching for the voices of forgotten people, people who've been marginalized, listening to silences. I was very influenced by the work of Michel Rolf-Trouillot about the Haitian Revolution. All of these factors led me to deepen the context in which I approached Tevis's report. And something else happened. Let me get to that next. So a few things that I learned. One was that the scene that Tevis describes with the Jewish children at the school in August 1941, it happened a month after the Germans arrived in that location. So it was described in the chaplain's report as if it were a sudden shock, that they had no idea, and suddenly they're encountered with the fact of German mass killing of Jews. In fact, they had been in that location for a month, and there were many, beginning on the first day, open and widely publicized killings of Jews right there. That was one thing that struck me as significant. The second was, I learned from a Jewish source that actually a lot of Jewish children had been evacuated from that region to the east in advance of the German arrival. And it suddenly made me think, was the number 90 actually not a large number, but a small number of children? Because in that region, the massacres of Jews in that summer were in the thousands and tens of thousands. The third thing that I learned was about the town itself. So Bilet Tserkva, that's the Ukrainian name. The German sources, they always mix up the name of the place. They described it as if it were an obscure, tiny village with like a weird, Slavic name. Jewish sources made it clear that Bilet Tserkva was a city, a considerable city, a historic site of Jewish learning. There were a number of Jewish schools and musical establishments there. And the city, Bilet Tserkva, was infamous as a site of violence against Jews. It had been a site of pogroms in the 1600s, terrible pogroms in the wake of World War I, and the Jewish community had rebuilt itself repeatedly. Now, some of you who might understand any Slavic languages may realize that the name of the place, Bilet Tserkva or Belaya Tserkov, it means white church. It means white church. The other thing that I also found is that in many Jewish sources from the region, they didn't call that town Bilet Tserkva. They called it Schwarze Tuma. which is like Yiddish, meaning like black rot. This was a grim play on words, right? For a town called White Church that was famous for its violence against Jews. So all of that really changed how I saw this event. And my colleague, Anna Sternches, who's a Yiddish scholar who works on a project of Yiddish songs from World War II, found a Yiddish song about the murder of Jewish children in Bilet Cerkva. There it is. I won't make any of you read it in Yiddish, but one of our PhD students, Ilayani, translated it into English, and Lindsay is going to read it for us.
Boy, what should we say and what should we tell when little children were buried alive? These were people on the 7th square. They were buried in a pit like a barrel. The assassins, the fascists, were pleased. They thought all the Jews had finally met their end. From the still fresh graves, one can hear a cry. People, revenge, take revenge on them. Not a single drop of their blood will go unanswered. We will destroy, wipe out the murderers. We will crush every one of them into the dust. They will pay for everything, for everything.
Thank you for reading that. Thinking about this evidence led me to ask the question, how had the murder of Jewish children become a tale of noble Christians trying to uphold goodness in the face of terrible odds? And what was the role of chaplains in that transformation? So this is the question that became central to my work. Okay, so now to part 2, Saving Christianity, Killing Jews. This is actually the title of chapter 4 of my book, and it's really the core chapter of the book, dealing with the summer of 1941, the summer after the German invasion of Soviet territory. And again, most of you probably know an explosion of mass killing of Jews, not in gas chambers, but mostly through open-air shootings, sometimes called Holocaust, the Holocaust by bullets. So, searching for material on chaplains, I came across a set of photographs from the summer of 1941. I found them early in my project when I was looking for illustrations for my book, and they were filed in the German Federal Archive in Koblenz under the file heading Pastoral Care to the Military. So in this group of photos, there were a series of pictures taken in the Ukrainian city of Zhytomyr, German-occupied Ukraine, in August 1941, the exact same time as Bilet Cerkva, that showed the reopening of a large cathedral in Zhytomyr, which had been closed under the Soviets, right? They closed a lot of churches, they used them for other purposes, and which the Germans celebrated the reopening of with a whole cleansing, operation and a church service. So I'm going to show you just some of those photos. You can see here there's translations from the original captions. Oh, I forgot to say, the photos were taken by the German Military Photo Service. So these are official German military photographs. You can see there the caption, German soldiers and Bolshevik prisoners cleanse the interior of the church from trash. Or this one, again, you can read the caption for yourself, but emphasizing the dirt and filth that had to be removed, and that on the Sunday, the church was ready for a reopening, a rededication with a Christian worship service for the chaplains. Here you see the inside, a very, very large cathedral, and a very tiny figure of the military chaplain in the middle. It was a Protestant chaplain preaching that day. This was the only one of the photos that actually showed a chaplain, which was also interesting to me because that was the heading they were filed under. And, finally this one, a closer scene showing that some of the local Ukrainian population, mostly women, were allowed to attend the religious service as well. And the file heading described the opening of the church as the gift of Christianity that the Germans had returned to the Ukrainian people. Now, when I originally found these photographs, I thought they would serve as illustrations for my book to show chaplains in action. What did they do? Well, here's something that they did. They preached the sermon, they presided over the reopening of churches, and this phenomenon was very common across the occupied Soviet territory, but for a short period of time in the summer of 1941. But again, over the decades between when I found those photos and when I finished my book, a lot changed in the field of Holocaust studies. One of the things, thanks to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the opening of archives, the drawing in of scholars, especially from Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, with language skills, so much new scholarship on the Holocaust in that region. And from people like John Paul Himka, Wendy Lauer, and others, I learned that Zhytomyr was the epicenter of the Holocaust in the summer of 1941, and that at exactly the same time as the reopening of that church, in the very same place, Zhytomyr was the site of extremely public massacres of Jews. So let me show you what I mean as the photo credits. One of my then PhD students, now done, Ryan Masters, found this photograph in the photo archives of the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And you can see there, it's August 1941. German soldiers literally piled on top of each other, watching the execution of 2 Soviet Jewish men accused of being NKVD, KGB agents. This mass execution was an extremely public event. There are dozens of photos extant. You could tell this is an amateur photo, right, compared to those other photographs, probably taken by a German soldier. There are a large number of such photos of this execution. Actually, a scholar, Jochen Helbeck, is working on that project. And we know that German soldiers were encouraged to attend those events together. Chaplains prided themselves on being in touch with their men and what they were doing. It's impossible that they would have been unaware of this particular event. Jews in the region were also forced to watch that execution. And this forcing victims to watch killing, it was very common practice, and maybe increased the, you could say, pleasure or sense of power of the killers. At least 400 Jewish men from the region were rounded up. Here's again, you can see the picture, forced to watch that, and afterwards Germans took them into a nearby forest and shot them. This scene also was photographed multiple times. So that opening of the churches, when I put it in juxtaposition with these other scenes, became not an isolated event, but rather an intertangled creation of a narrative of righteousness. What were the Germans doing there? Killing Jews or saving Christianity? And I can also say that the story from the Gospel, the New Testament story, I think it appears in all 4 Gospels, of Jesus driving the money changers out of the temple. This was the subject of the sermon on numerous of these church openings, I believe on the very one pictured here. And you can see how even the photographs kind of replicate that narrative. Okay, so chaplains' presence, their existence, it served to confer a blessing, sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit, on the German war effort. One of the things I was looking for always in my project were sermons by chaplains. They turn out to be very difficult to find. And again, if you think about the conditions under which they were working, it's like, who's going to listen to those long sermons and so on. However, thanks to those reports, I also found some very interesting sermons, many of them by this man, a Protestant chaplain, Eberhard Müller, who I think was very proud of his sermons. And he often included excerpts of them in his periodic reports, along with his commentary on them. So we're going to have reader number 3. Show me where you are. Excellent. Oh, yeah. Wait, is that right? Is it number 3? Yeah. Number 4, sorry, thank you. Reader number 4. Maggie, going to read us an excerpt from Müller's sermon and his comment, whenever you're ready.
If God is for us, who is against us? The one who did not withhold his own son, but gave him up for all of us. Will he not with him also give us everything else? Who will bring any charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is to condemn? Who will separate us from the love of Christ? As it is written, for your sake we are being killed all day long. We are accounted as sheep to be slaughtered. I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ our Lord. Romans 8:31 to 39. Again and again, the question came back to Christ. And the darker the situation was, and the more serious the look in the spiritual future, all the more wonderful was it to bear witness for Christ as the light of the world. As individuals, the comrades were all moved by the same question. How can God allow this killing? Why are we humans so crazy? Where will we get the inner strength to bear it?
Thank you. Thank you for the reading. As you can tell from that sermon and the comment, Chaplain Miller was not preaching some Nazified version of Christianity. It was traditional message carried straight from Christian scripture. And I should also tell you that Miller was not a Nazi Party member or a fanatical Nazi. After the war, he was actually a very important voice for democratization in West Germany, which is another interesting question. And working with sources like this, I got a strong sense that it was necessary to really understand the topic to get outside of the perpetrator's perspective and to see the chaplains not only through their own eyes, but through the eyes of others. So this was quite difficult because, particularly with Jewish sources, many of them were not really conscious of who was a chaplain. You know what I mean? They were difficult to spot. They just looked like regular officers, only they had slightly different markings. But there are many Jewish sources that do comment on the role of Christianity and of Christian clergy in the Holocaust. So I tried to really be attuned for finding such sources. And one really vivid example comes from a post-war interview with this woman, Agnes Mandel-Adachi, who was a Hungarian Jewish survivor. And Adachi had actually been baptized as a Protestant during the war. And perhaps because of that, she was moving around in the city of Budapest in 1944, working with Raoul Wallenberg, trying to save Jews from transports. And in that context, the scene that's described in the next reading occurred. It's very short, and we have reader number 5. Thank you.
There was a little child, was a star, who had evidently lost her parents. And there was a church, and out came a Catholic priest, wearing inside his collar the Hungarian Nazi collar. And he had a revolver, and he saw that little child, and he shot her. I picked up the child, and she was dead.
Thank you. This is the kind of glimpse that you get from sources that raise so many questions. Who was that man that she saw? Was it a military chaplain? There was actually a famous Arrow Cross killer called Andras Kuhn, who often did wear a clerical collar. Was it that? Was this a scene from a movie that she reproduced in her memory? Is also possible. The thing to me that was important was to juxtapose Muller's account with Adachi's. In Muller's account, the Holocaust looked like just another part of God's plan. And what was really important was God's boundless love for his people and his mercy. For Adachi, genocide looked like a Christian priest killing a Jewish child in front of a church. So again, that juxtaposition is central to my work. So let's go to the third section, genocidal culture. A turning point for me working on this book, and again, this might sound so simple, as a historian, was when I decided to organize the book chronologically. It seems obvious, but a lot of works aren't chronological. Because when I started to put my sources in order, what I realized is that almost everything that had been written, which isn't much, about chaplains, ended in 1941 or focused only on that explosion of mass violence as if it were the exception. But I thought, what happened next? That's 1941. The war didn't end until 1945. Those chaplains, including Tavis, who saw the 90 Jewish kids, and so none of them left their jobs. They stayed for 4 more years working within that field. So I thought, what happens in that later phase of the war? And this is where I developed this notion of genocidal culture. And I guess I would describe it like this. Think about the difference between an explosion and a heat wave. Both of them are deadly. Heat wave may even be more deadly, but it's a different form, right, of destruction. It's spread out in a different way. And this is what I saw happening in this later part of the war. So what I mean by the concept of genocidal culture is a society or a culture in which resources and institutions are mobilized in such a way as to enable, sustain, and cover up from its perpetrators of genocide and mass violence. So society literally organizes itself, religion, education systems, in such a way to enable, sustain, and cover those crimes. And to show how this worked in the context of World War II, I want to turn our direction from east to the west to German-occupied France. And I'm trying to think if there's anything I need to explain to you before we hear reader number 6, only that this description of the German commander Stulpnagel and his encounter with the chaplain comes from a post-war recollection of a different chaplain, if you know what I mean. So it's a third-hand story. So who's our reader for Stulpnagel? Thank you.
One evening, General Otto von Stulpnagel invited the senior Catholic chaplain to dine. When the two were alone, the general asked the priest, "What do you think of the practice of shooting hostages?" The priest answered evasively, "Sir, you are under orders. What can you do?" But the general would have none of it. "Not like that, Father. I want your opinion as a Catholic priest." And the chaplain answered, "If you have to ask me that way, then I have to tell you, I cannot justify it." "My opinion exactly," said the general, and handed in his resignation. Stulpnagel was transferred to a distant post and later became involved in the July 20th, 1942 plot against him.
Okay, thank you. Now, when I first found this report, I thought, maybe this is an example of at least what a chaplain might have done, right? The chaplains might have convinced some, leading German military figures, many of whom were quite devout Christians, to change their practices. But there was no way to verify any of this. No name of the chaplain. Stulpnagel killed himself after the war, so there's no source from him. So again, I filed it under maybe what could have been. Years later, I came across another account from the scholar Raoul Hilberg, and reader 7, thank you.
There was a hostage problem, and there was an army general who did not feel comfortable shooting a lot of Frenchmen. 3 Frenchmen shot for a dead German was okay, but 100? He had to keep the peace. So he suggested the following. How about Jews as substitutes? Who would think of that? And indeed, the first trains going out to the death camps from the periphery of Germany left the same month, March 1942. One from France and another from Slovakia.
Thank you. Do you see what's happening there? This account doesn't include the chaplain. So in the first story, we see Stulpnagel having a dilemma. French people are going to revolt if we carry out the reprisals. Then he has the idea, wait a second, will kill Jews instead of non-Jewish French citizens, and that way, no one's going to care. This is exactly what they did. But now Stulpnagel, this is genocide culture, gets turned into a hero, right? The Jews get erased from the story, and you'll see it gets even more complicated. So I found another source. We'll, read this one too. So in killing those hostages, the Germans allowed a military chaplain, a German military chaplain, there were several of them, to minister to the French Christians before their execution. It seems bizarre, but this is what they did. One of the chaplains who did that, Franz Stock, is on his way to being beatified, considered like a huge hero of French-German rapprochement. But here's an excerpt from his diary that describes the same scene. I'm sorry this is complicated. I can tell you more in the question and answer. But let's hear from this. Is that reader 8?
Mine came with a preamble that said you should probably speak French, which I do not.
That's fine.
So I'm going to do my best.
Fake it as best you can.
Monday, September 21st, 1942, my birthday. Picked up at 7 a.m. and brought to Mauvalet-Rien. 46 hostages shot. Senior priest Hoffer and Pastor Peters went with us. Planned to read Mass before was scuttled, not enough time, and no practicing Catholics among them. There was only a little time to organize their things and write a short letter. Only a few of them were receptive to religious support. Many not baptized, atheists, or totally alienated. They sang Marseillaise and the Internationale and called Long Live Stalin, Talman, etc.
Beautiful.
Afterward, cremated.
Thank you. Thank you. So you see what's happening there. Stock going to minister to the French Catholics, but disappointed because many not baptized atheists, i.e., they were Jews. So again, the switch that Stulpnagel advocated, that Hilberg identified, and Stock participated in, and there's Stock, the stamp to commemorate him, literally killed Jews as hostages in order to keep peace with the German occupiers and the French population, then turned the German commander who made that organization into a hero of the resistance, and the Wehrmacht chaplain who ministered to those French Catholics into a saint. This is what I mean by genocidal culture, right? A culture organized to sustain and cover up the nature of its crimes. So, okay, thinking about the occupation made me wonder about the daily lives of chaplains. And one of the things that, again, took me a long time to figure out, even though it's obvious, is that chaplains, like many German officers and regular soldiers, they were often billeted in people's homes in the occupied territories. You stop and think about the implications of that, and it is so horrifying. Women forced to cook for them, to clean up after them, to do their laundry, prepare their food. So I started trying to get some research assistants to look into this billeting, like what was these housing arrangements like? We can talk about that later. But one of the accounts that a research assistant who speaks Russian, Sharon Minos, found was from this woman, Nama Bakshi, who's from the Krimchaka Jewish group in the Crimea. They had Germans billeted in that region. But what I was most interested in her quote, I won't read you the whole thing, she describes the different ethnicities in the region. I just want to draw your attention to the last, when she writes, when Germans, SS Gestapo death squad soldiers, arrived in her neighborhood, they kicked out the residents and took over their homes. To identify that a house was now occupied by a German, they drew a cross on it. You stop and think about this, the Nazi German military marking properties with a cross, puts them in the long line going back to Constantine, to the Crusades, to the plague, to the pogroms, of marking with a cross that which is blessed, that which will triumph, that which will conquer. and of the cross serving as the reverse, a curse on the deicides, right? The Jews who killed Jesus. This idea of marking with a cross is mentioned in so many Jewish and also Soviet sources, never mentioned in German sources. It's like the water you swim in, right? You don't see that water around you. Now, further pursuing this idea of the image of the cross and the marking with the cross and sanctification, I started looking for photographs that showed crosses. And I came across this photo of Paulette Feiler, a Jewish girl in hiding in a convent in France, here at her first communion in 1943. And reading into the sources at the Holocaust Museum, I discovered that Paulette Feiler's mother was a Lithuanian Jew who was arrested in 1942, managed to get her two daughters into a convent, for safety, before she was sent to Majdanek and murdered. When the news came that the mother was dead, the priest in charge of the school called the two girls and said, "Now you are alone. The time has come for you to be baptized." This is the backstory. Now you may be wondering, maybe not, what about Paulette Feiler's father? I almost stopped breathing when I read in the sources that Paulette Feiler's father was a Russian Jew who was rounded up as a hostage in the Stulpnagel roundups, shot at Mont Valérien, maybe even on the very action that Franz Stock described in his birthday. So, Paulette Feiler. So chaplains, they performed the sacraments, they offered Mass, they gave general absolution, they gave, as you can see, often implicit promises of salvation for men who died at war. They also offered the comfort of Christian burial and the promise of forgiveness, not only to men at war themselves, but to the men's families. This letter was so striking to me. It was reported by a chaplain as a kind of evidence of his relevance, that he had received a letter from the family of an SS man that wrote, "Only after we received your detailed and comforting letter did our hearts find some consolation, because we knew that our darling had received a proper burial from you in the memorial cemetery." And I wondered if that consolation also included a sense that perhaps the blessing of the chaplain meant that their son was not a murderer, or if he was, that God had forgiven him. Now I got the last point, but I'm so close to out of time. But can I do the last point? Is that okay? Sorry, I realize I have a little bit too much material. So one of the things with the genocidal culture that I think is also important and often sort of covered up is not only do we see a sort of phenomenon of saving Christianity and killing Jews, but also saving Christianity and killing Judaism. So the destruction of Judaism as a real existing sort of religion and community in the region. And often Jewish synagogues were used as sites of roundups and mass killing. And I want to just give you one example of this synagogue, Bel Hatuf Synagogue in occupied Poland. It was a site of at least 3 different killing operations. The final one was in 1942. You see how it looked before, when the remaining Jews in the ghetto and the region were all forced into the synagogue and it was lit on fire. And we have an account from, remarkably, a survivor of that fire, a woman, Esther Cinnamon. And we have the last reader, reader number 9.
They pushed us into that synagogue, and it was so hot. We were screaming and crying, the children, the screaming. I think only God could hear the screaming. On the window glasses, it was pouring. The steam from the people, like it was raining.
And again, you wouldn't see such description, thank you, in any sources created, from chaplains or from the Germans. Okay, so that synagogue was located across a very small square from the Catholic Church. And you could see here that just a week later, the possessions of Jews who were murdered there, their dishes and so on, were sold right there at the church across the square. So I want to end by pointing out how genocidal culture also affects the memory of the past. And again, I just will illustrate with one specific case. So maybe some of you have heard the name of this man, Albrecht Goethe, quite a well-known German writer, a German theologian, probably most famous for a short novella published in 1950 called The Restless Night, Unruhige Nacht. And that novella, it tells the story of a German military chaplain in occupied Ukraine, Venetia, who spends the last night before his execution with a soldier condemned for desertion. So we've seen mention of this a few times, right? Chaplains had to do that. Goethe wrote a novella about it. And that thing you can see was translated, so published in 1950, translated into multiple languages, made into a German TV program in 1955, a British TV program, BBC, a very celebrated German movie in 1958, and always kind of held up as a testament to the horror of war and the really nobility of the chaplain trying to maintain a Christian presence in that, hell situation. In that short novella, there is an entire one sentence devoted to the killing of Jews. This is the sentence. As for the pogroms against the Jews, various people beyond the circle of those directly involved knew more than they could bear. That's it. Goethe, the author, usually described as a Protestant theologian, sometimes as a prison chaplain, was a military chaplain. I found his name in a number of places. He was also stationed right there in Venetia. And again, you can see how that functions. And when I first put that together, I thought, why is the name Venetia ringing a bell? It's because one of the most famous photographs of the Holocaust, this on the right, the last Jew of Venetia, widely circulated at the time of the Eichmann trial, and since, of course, is from that same place, an epicenter, again, of mass murder of Jews. And I was struck by how the scene from the movie, The Restless Night, that's the German 1958 movie, both echoes and erases the scene on the right. On the right, you have the drama of the perpetrators and their victim, like literally starkly in your eyes. The dead Jews already killed, the man about to be killed, the others watching, the German with the gun. On the symbol from the movie, on the image from the movie, the human drama has been replaced with the very simple drama. Now, the Jews are all gone, the killers are all gone. The drama is between the soldier who's made the ultimate sacrifice and the chaplain who channels God's boundless love and mercy. So the last image I want to show that I want to end with really helped me think about those two images because of the issue of inversion. So this image from an earlier time was found by another of my grad students, Glenn Ryland, from the Berlin Cathedral. It's one of the Beatitudes, right? Blessed are the peacemakers. And this image was put up right at the end of the Herero-Nama genocide, the German mass killing of Herero-Nama in Namibia, what was then German Southwest Africa. And look at the image, how the figure of the black man is shown as the aggressor. The white figures are both the victim, the knight in his armor, and the victor. And of course, the figure of Jesus unites those two, right? The victim and the victor over death. And I thought about this common inversion, depicting the aggressor as themselves somehow the victim, and how the Nazi version added a further refinement. It removed the victims from the picture altogether. So that's the end, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, wonderful. I actually don't have the time in front of me, but I'm sure we have some time for question and answer, and maybe it's just best to get food after. You're just up to, yeah? Yeah, okay, great.
I have a hearing disability, so I'm going to ask Lindsay to repeat the questions to make sure.
You mentioned a connection with the French clergy. Did you find any correspondence or connection with other, between the German clergy and maybe like the Russian Orthodox or any other groups?
Did you get it?
Connections with other chaplains?
Yeah.
I'll try to answer briefly. There's so much more to be done in that case, but 100% for sure. So we know, for example, Hungarian chaplains and also Romanian chaplains. Of course, those were German Axis partners. They were quite directly involved. I think I even have a case of a Romanian chaplain who himself was a killer at a pogrom. So definitely there's chaplains in those other armies, but they do play multiple different roles. There's also Italian chaplains. Italians were also in the Eastern Front. And one Italian chaplain, he was a close friend of Pius XII. And he wrote a letter, another colleague found that, I didn't find that source, where he said, the Germans have killed all the Jews of Ukraine, and next are the Jews of Poland. A chaplain, like from his vantage point, he wrote that. However, there's also a film made by Rossellini glorifying Italian chaplains as like fighting the good fight against communism. And I think that movie affected the Albrecht Goerss interpretation. So you have chaplains doing a bunch of different things on various different sides. Super interesting. And the one last thing, at the end of the war, the German chaplains, they really parlay their position into a bridge between the British and French and American chaplains. And often, sometimes it's actually kind of moving that, you know, they're able to get maybe better treatment of some of the prisoners of war because they find a common ground in that Christian witness. So yeah, the other chaplains are super interesting. We can take a few if that's quicker.
Oh, do you think that's quicker? Okay. Maggie, Chrissy, and I think there was...
As long as I don't forget
there's
them.
one more back here. Okay. We'll start with Maggie.
I'm sorry, but this is so parallel to what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in Israel. In a weird way, you can write a parallel book the same way about we need to kill all Palestinians to save Judaism and the culture of genocide. It's just all there. In a weird way, if you're looking at the creation of the world, with what you are doing, we have arrived at the star, and after the creation we're looking at it. Here we are looking at the inception of the star. And I'm just very upset.
I'm going to hear the other questions, and I'm going to answer a few at once.
In the back, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
I guess my question was, it seems like they were pretty institutionally involved in the Wehrmacht, but was there an initial wave of chaplains that were pulled from like actively serving ministers and priests, and how did they replenish ranks throughout the war?
Can you summarize? I thought the initial wave...
Were they all kind of integrated into the Wehrmacht, or were they pulled out of service? And then how did they replenish them throughout the war? Great. Chrissy and Edmond.
So my question was, do you think that the chaplains, them seeing the deaths of people who were so repentant for their desertion, solidified their belief that what they were doing was right?
I was wondering
Do you want
to what extent the soldiers themselves were asking for chaplains to be deployed with them.
Okay. Should we do that round, or do you want another one?
Maybe I better do those before I forget, right? Maybe I'll do them in the reverse order, just so I remember the last question. Were the soldiers themselves asking? You know, chaplains, what I didn't have time to talk about, but they were in a kind of precarious position vis-a-vis the state authorities. Because even though most Nazis themselves were Christians, some Nazi leadership thought it's old-fashioned. Why do we need those chaplains? We should be able to have more almost like what the Soviets had, those political commissars, you know? And they do introduce those at the end. But the chaplains were constantly fighting for their own relevance. So they're always gathering information. This is going to be a very familiar dynamic to those of us who are professors. They're always gathering information on how well they're doing, on how much people want them, on, how many soldiers come. That's why they gather all those statistics, And what's interesting is the initial setup, the SS and the Luftwaffe did not have chaplains. So those were the new units that were created, right, by the Nazis, and they were created without chaplains. However, chaplains were constantly boasting that these SS, like the guy with the letter, they asked for us to come and bury their guys. These Luftwaffe asked for us to come and do these religious services. So they really used that to show their relevance. However, after the war, suddenly they can say to those American chaplains, we were actually persecuted inside the Wehrmacht because the, Nazis, they told us that we weren't allowed to bury people unless they explicitly, had requested a Christian burial. They told us we weren't allowed to serve the SS. So it's a really back and forth thing. And on the one hand, they complain all the time that the soldiers don't care and that they're, Nazified, that they're mocking them, that they're saying Christianity makes you weak. Blessed are the meek, like who needs that? But then when they really find the utility is when the war effort turns against Germany. And, there's a lot of casualties and a lot of deaths. But yeah, so it's a real tangled skein. Okay, that's that. The self-justification, the chaplains for themselves, I think this is a really keen insight because I believe strongly that those narratives of rectitude are also for themselves, 100%, right? And so, for example, now when you have those sermons of driving the money changers out of the temple and saying, what are we doing here? What are we doing here? We are bringing Christianity back to the people who've been, brutalized by years of Soviet rule and all that. For sure, that's important for them because, and again, to me, that was one of the biggest things I feel like I learned in this process is that so often we tend to analyze in terms of bad people, bad individuals, but it's not like that. It's like the institution is so important. So that goes to the question about, back here, right, the question about the institution. And, again, you're onto something I think really, really important because the question of how chaplains were chosen, something I spent a lot of time with. And the biggest criteria, this is a super complicated process. They had to be approved by the bishop and by the military bishop and by the Gestapo, a security check, and by the church ministry. They went through all those steps. The biggest thing that was weeded out were troublemakers, any kind of troublemakers. If they had been too ardently Nazi and their congregations didn't like them, those were troublemakers. They weren't wanted. So, they're that kind of sorting. And so it's not like it's a different group of people, but step by step they get drawn into an institution that is serving a certain goal. So yeah, the institutional piece is super crucial. And then, Maggie, to your question, the only thing I can say is yes. And to me, it seems like the three things that I said at the beginning, the role of religion in war, how institutions function and how systems function to hide themselves, I feel like it actually applies in many, many different settings. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is the role of the churches in residential schools. And the same thing, you can think about a narrative of righteousness. You can think about an institutional choice that hides the damage done because it provides those narratives of, we didn't know, we were just doing the right thing. And of course, many people sincerely are. And so, the whole idea about intent and all that, it seems that's why, like I said, I had to get outside the chaplain's own sources, because inside the own sources, you always see the idea of, yes, but my intent was pure, or yes, but here's why it had to be like this. Looking outside the sources is where you can see this is the system. So I got to say, I think, sadly, that kind of combination of institutions and, forces and that sort of covering, it's quite, I don't know what to say, but it's pretty ubiquitous, and you can look around and see it in lots of places.
Great. Okay, wonderful. Oh, we're going to do, let's do a couple more.
One more and then we'll end.
Thank you.
So, part 1 and 2, at the beginning, I think it was Jews, did you say? The 90 Jewish children? The reading?
Yep.
Where he's he said against orders, like, I will get involved.
Yeah.
What happened there? What happened to those children?
What happened to the kids
Those
in the
kids,
church, yeah?
the kids were all killed. And the thing about it is it's also quite an interesting thing, because if you look at the chaplains' accounts, they prevaricate on that. They're like, well, we don't know, it was probably the Ukrainians who killed the kids. Like, they always like still step away from, we tried to help, we couldn't do anything. And they actually did more. They went to the commander and they tried to get an intervention, and then, then the kids were killed. And they just say, like, we don't know, maybe it was the Ukrainians. And at first I wrote it that way, like Ukrainian guards. But it's clear from the Jewish sources that those kids were killed by that SS killing squad, who also killed the parents and so on. And the other thing, if I can just add about that, and again, like, when I first found that account, it's so moving about those chaplains, like, trying, and they bring in other people, and I mean, I don't want to, like I say, just completely explode that narrative, but it just doesn't make any sense. Like, when you start to look deeper, even the passage they describe, how they say, we saw some mothers, they were looking through the window, they could do nothing. First, they never mentioned those women again. And later I thought, it makes no sense. If you're standing outside a building, you can't see in two rooms at the same time. They can't see the mother. Like, I suddenly realized I don't have a great sense of space, but you know what I mean? It's like, it makes no sense. So like, why did they add that flourish? And to me, it's like a narrative piece that, again, in a very sort of subtle way, suggests that Jews were somehow almost passively accepting their fate. You know what I mean? That those women were there too, but they could. But it's like it was the chaplains who are looking through the window helplessly. They add in almost those but it's actually them. They're the ones looking through. So like that whole scene, I really have gone over it so many times. But yeah, those kids were killed, and like Bila Tserkva, I think that Jewish community was really wiped out. There's a small number of survivors. Well, I'll add one thing on that, which is, oh, sorry.
Have you followed, I don't know the extent of your trajectory, but have you followed up on any of those chaplains? And did any of them have any writings or diaries that came up after the war? Like, did any of them ask for redemption at all?
Followed up on their writing after? Mm-hmm. I hope I'm saying the truth when I say that I have read every single chaplain memoir and diary published after the war that I could get my hands on. Like, and, I read German, I spent a lot of time in Germany, whatever. But stuff is still coming out. So I'll give you one example. I have to try to tell it briefly. So I did a workshop on my book before it was finished, and I invited some scholars to come and like read the draft and all that. And two of the scholars I invited, it's actually a married couple, Hartmut and Silke Lehmann, two historians from Germany, and they are in their 80s. So this is important. And they're in their 80s and like very distinguished. He had like a long, distinguished career working on German, religion. And they were reading my manuscript. They live in Kiel in Germany. They were talking to some friend of theirs, maybe dog walking, like random friend. And they're like, oh, we're going to Toronto to work on this chaplain manuscript with our friend. And that friend said to them, my father was a military chaplain. And they're like, what? Her father was a German military chaplain, Protestant, captured at Stalingrad by the Soviets. The Soviets brought a group of those German intellectuals to Moscow, and they made I guess you would call it like a propaganda publicity unit. They did all these radio broadcasts in German, trying to get the German people to surrender, and then so that chaplain, he gave all these sermons from Moscow saying, don't be afraid, don't think that your real enemies are the Nazis. And that was her dad. And that woman's mother, she was born after the war, but her mom was arrested. So when that dad, was giving those sermons, the Gestapo came over and arrested her mom and her older brother. They sent them to some concentration camp. They did that to family members, and they survived the war. And so that woman tells my friend, we have all these sermons and materials from my dad. Would you be interested in them? And And this came out of my book. So that guy's name is Johannes Schröder. If any of you read German, you could find that volume. It was published very quickly. It's in German. It's not in English yet. Hartmut Lehmann, Silke Lehmann, I can't remember the name of their two friends, 4 co-editors. The sermons and letters of Johannes Schröder writing from the Soviet Union during wartime. So this is where I say, like, new stuff is always coming out. And, like, he, for sure, like, you know, called on other chaplains also. But most of the chaplains, not too many published afterwards. Mostly they do what you would have predicted. They write, like, it's more, one of them is called, How Much Suffering Can a Human Being Bear? And when I saw the title, I was like, oh, what is that book going to be talking about? Well, it's his own suffering, you know. It's a very moving memoir. So yeah, like they skirt toward the issues, but, you know, okay, but then the last thing I have to say, but there's, I don't know if you call it a happy ending. I think while all that justification is going on, like in the movies and all that, under the surface, when both East and West Germany rearm in the 1950s, they completely repudiate that model of military chaplaincy. The East Germans are like, forget about it, we're not doing that again. No chaplains, communist state. The West Germans, they recreate the chaplaincy, but they are not officers anymore. They're only connected with the church. They have no military chain of command, and their job is to be the voice of conscience in the military. So it's like, you know, so no one says, like, this was terrible. A few people say it, but not many. The public thing is they were just upholding Christianity. But under the surface, it's like, we're not going to do it that way again. And they create a different kind of chaplaincy. It hasn't been tested that much, right, because of the German military situation. But now, like, if someone says, I want to be a conscientious objector, the chaplain's job is to counsel them how they can do that.
Wonderful.
And now we're done, right? The people are hungry.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Doris.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions and for reading.